There are times when we want to execute code over and over and over again. Now we can do that by copying and pasting, but that's not really a good idea. For example, what if we have a web page with 50 hyperlinks and we want to modify those hyperlinks in the same way? Well, if we did that by hand, that would take a lot of time and it would take a lot of code. So we need something better to do the same type of thing. Well, we have loops. Loops allow us to execute the same code for a certain amount of time, and we can do that by writing less code and making our code more efficient. JavaScript has 3 loops that we can use, and while they do the same thing of repeating code over and over again, they're used for slightly different purposes. Now, this is the Try It section. We will go through all 3 of these loops, so feel free to follow along. The first loop we will talk about is the for loop. It is denoted by the for keyword here, and then a set of parentheses follow the for keyword. Now, the for loop is used to execute code, which is inside of its code block here within these curly braces. It's to execute this code a certain amount of times. In this case, we initialize a variable counter. We call it I. I is just common for being a counter for loops, and we initialize it as 0. This is because we start counting as 0 in JavaScript. Some programming languages start at 1, but the majority of them start with 0. So get used to counting from 0 because we do it all the time. So we initialize a variable counter here with 0, and then we specify for how long this loop is going to execute. And we do that by using a condition. As long as I is less than 20, we are going to execute the code within this loop here. So we will execute 20 times because we start with 0, and we end whenever we reach 19. So we execute 20 times. Now, each of these loop initialization segments are terminated with a semicolon. And that's very important because if you omit the semicolon, then JavaScript will actually throw an error. So we need to put a semicolon after the initialization of the counter and after the condition for the loop. And finally, we have how we increment the counter here. And we're using the increment operator. What this does is this increments I, but it returns I first. So if I is 0, then this increment, or this little code here, will return 0, and then it will increment it to 1. Now we could actually put the plus before I, and this will increment I and then return it. So if I is 0 and then this executes, then we actually return 1. So there is a difference between how you put the increment operator before or after the variable that we want to increment. Now, let's look at the body of this loop here. What we are doing is we are determining if I, the counter, is odd or even, and we do that by using the mod operator. Now, the mod operator takes both of these operands here, it divides the left operand by the right operand, and then returns the remainder. So if I is odd, this operation is going to return something other than 0. And since all numbers other than 0 are a truthy value, then the code in here is going to execute continue. And continue tells JavaScript to skip this iteration of the loop and go to the next one. So whenever we start this loop, I is 0. So we come in here and we use this mod operation here. We divide 0 by 2, and the remainder of which is 0. So this code does not execute. So then we take total, which is 0, and we add it by 0, which is 0. So the loop then iterates again, and this time I is 1. So we come here, and we take I divided by 2, and then we take that remainder, which is not 0, so this is going to be true. Continue executes. We skip this code here, and then we go to the next iteration, which will be 2. I will be 2. We'll go through this. This will not execute because this will be false. And then we take 0 plus 2, so total will be 2 then. So basically we are adding only even numbers here. So we're taking the even numbers in between 0 and really 19 because we exit the loop when I is 20. So between 0 and 19, we are taking the even numbers, adding them together, and then displaying them with total. Now, the problem with loops is that we can get into an infinite loop, and it's really easy to do that. All it takes is just not really mentioning or not really paying attention to what you're doing. Like here, I am incrementing I by multiplying it by itself. Well, I is 0, so 0 times 0 is always going to be 0. So we're going to get in an infinite loop. And let's show this in a browser. I'm going to use Internet Explorer. Actually, let's add something here so that we can see what exactly it's doing. I'm going to alert I within the loop. So we're going to get a ton of alert boxes. So let's open this in Internet Explorer. And I will allow blocked content, and we get our first alert message, and we keep getting them. Now, I can keep doing this all day long. It's not going to change, which is unfortunate. So I'm going to, oops, I didn't get it. There we go. I had to press F12 to pull up the developer tools because I can go into the console and I can modify the value of I. So I am going to set it to 2 because even if I set it as 1, that's not going to really do anything because 1 times 1 is still 1, so we'll still be caught in an infinite loop. But if I start with 2, then we can start doing things, or it can start reacting normally. So this next one should be 4, and then 16, 22, and then there we go, we are out of the loop. So it's very easy to get into infinite loops. Just always be mindful of your counters, always be mindful of really your entire initialization here and your condition. So that you can avoid getting into infinite loops. So that is the for loop. It's a loop that we want to use for a certain number of times. Next is the while loop, and it executes as long as this condition is true. So here we have we start with a variable called I that is going to be our counter again, just so that we can tell the user how many times we have run this code. And then we use the prompt function to allow the user to input their name, and then we store that data within this username variable. Then we compare whatever they typed in to the word exit. So as long as they don't type exit, this loop is going to execute. And so we will alert a message, hello, you have run this so many times, and we are using the increment operator before I. This is so that whenever we show the data to them, we show it to them in a human readable form, because most humans don't start counting at 0, they start counting at 1. So we'll show 1 first, and then 2, and then 3, and 4, and so on. And then we want to prompt the user again, because with every loop iteration here, we need to at least set some new value to username. Otherwise, we would be in another infinite loop, and we don't want to do that. So if we run this code, we will get a prompt box, and I will type in my name, Jeremy. So, hello, Jeremy, you have run this 1 time. So let's type in something else. We'll type in Stephen. Stephen, you've run this 2 times. Let's type in John. And so you kind of get the gist of how this works. But if I type in exit, then we are out of the loop, and that's because this condition then becomes false, because we are testing that username is not exit. So as long as we didn't type exit, this will be true. This loop will execute. We need to make sure that we have another chance to modify username again, and then the condition is tested again. The loop goes through if this is true, and if it's false, then it just exits out. So that's the while loop. Now there is a similar loop called the do while loop. And, oh, that's not the right code. Just give me a second, I'll get the right code there. Oh, the magic of editing. Okay, so now we have a do while loop. And let's compare this to the while loop. Okay, so the while loop, we did our condition test first. So if the user typed in exit the first time, the loop wouldn't even execute because then this would be false and we would then drop down here and execute code down after the loop. Well, the do while is in reverse. We execute the code first. So the loop goes through one iteration first, and then we perform the test. So this will prompt the user to input their name, and whenever they do input their name, then they will get an alert box that says, "Hello, username, you have run this so many times." And then it will run again. It will prompt the user again. And as long as username is not exit, then it will keep going through this loop. So let's close that. Let's open up the third example here. Okay, so we are being prompted. If I type in Jeremy, we'll see you've run this one time. And then it's going to prompt again. We'll do Steven again. You've run this 2 times. And the problem with this, though, if we type exit, we're going to see, "Hello exit, you've run this 3 times. But then the condition is evaluated because now username is exit, and then it will exit out. And this is where we get the terms pretest and post-test loops. The while loop is a pretest loop. It tests its condition first, and then it executes the code within the loop if that condition results as true. With the do while, it is a post test. It executes the loop at least one time, and then it tests its condition. So if we typed exit the first time, we would get the alert message that said hello exit, and then we would exit out of the loop. The for loop is also a pre-test. We are testing here before the loop is iterated. So if we actually change this code to is I less than 0, then nothing within here would execute and total would be 0 because we didn't do really anything here. So each loop has its own purpose. Whatever loop we use is really determined upon what our needs are at that time.